the Reformed viewpoint of original sin. Now, that term, original sin, is often misunderstood in the popular arena. Some people just assume that the term original sin must refer to the first sin, the original that we've all copied in many different ways in our own lives. That is, the first sin of Adam and Eve. But that's not what is referred to historically in the church by the doctrine of original sin. Rather, the doctrine of original sin defines the consequences to the human race of that first sin. And virtually every church historically that has had a creed or a confession has agreed that something very serious happened to the human race as a result of the first sin. That the first sin produced original sin. That is, as a result of the sin of Adam and Eve, the entire human race fell. And so that our nature as human beings since the fall is a nature that has been influenced by the power of evil. As David declared in the Old Testament, O God, I was born in sin, and in sin did my mother conceive me. He was not saying that it was a sinful thing for his mother and father to have borne children, nor was he saying that he had done something evil by being born, but rather he was acknowledging the human condition of fallenness. That fallenness that was part of the experience of his parents, that fallenness that he brings himself into this world. And so original sin has to do with the fallen nature of mankind. The idea is that we are not sinners because we sin, but that we sin because we are sinners. We are by nature sinners. And we've all heard the axiom, nobody's perfect. We might improve upon that a little bit by saying, not only is no one perfect, but no one's even close to perfection. And so the doctrine of total depravity describes and defines a particular view of original sin that has its roots in the teaching of St. Augustine. And remember that Augustine was the patron saint of the monastery where Martin Luther was reared in the faith, and where he taught at Wittenberg. He was an Augustinian monk, and also Augustine was the most revered mentor of John Calvin, so that the thinking of Augustine had an enormous influence in the shaping of the doctrine of the Protestant Reformation. Now, what total depravity does not mean in the Reformed tradition is what we call utter depravity. Utter depravity. We often use the term total as a synonym for utter or for completely. And so the notion of total depravity conjures up the idea that every human being is as bad as that person could possibly be. You might think of some arch fiends of history like Adolf Hitler and say there was absolutely no redeeming virtue left in the man. But I suspect that he had some affection for his mother, and as wicked as Adolf Hitler was, we can still conceive of his being even more wicked than he actually was. And so the idea of total depravity doesn't mean that every human being is as wicked as they could possibly be, but rather it means that the fall is so serious that it affects the whole person. Our fallenness that captures and grips our human nature affects our bodies. That's why we become ill and we die. It affects our minds and our thinking. We still have the capacity to think, but the Bible speaks about the way in which the mind has become darkened and weakened. The will of man is no longer in its pristine state of moral power, but the will, according to the New Testament, is now in bondage. We are enslaved to the evil impulses and desires of our hearts. And so the mind, the will, the spirit, the whole person has been infected by the power of sin. Now, again, if that's as far as we would go with the definition of total depravity, most Christian communions would say, yea and amen, this far. I mean, most would agree that we're fallen and that the fall is a serious thing and that the human nature that we bring into this world has been so influenced by sin that it touches every part of our nature. Again, most Catholic or universal creeds of Christendom would grant that much. So then the debate becomes over a question of degree. How far have we fallen? What is the degree of that human corruption? Now, I like to replace the term total depravity with my favorite designation, which is radical corruption. It's a concept that my friends find very easy to remember as they make their own acrostic for it. They just abbreviate radical corruption by the initials RC. They take great delight in the ease with which this facilitates their memory as they have a living model before them of radical corruption. I remember a gym teacher I had in the 7th grade when he called the roll for the first day that he was there and called my name, RC, as that's what I was called in grade school, and he said, "Oh, rotten crabapple." So in that instant, I had a new nickname that I probably should not have mentioned because I'll probably hear it again in these days. But the reason why we use this term, although it completely ruins our flower garden here, the tulip now becomes rulip, and nobody's going to remember that. But the reason I prefer this is because of the term radical. Now, again, there's another one of those words that we use bandied about in various ways in our culture, particularly in the political arena, where we say somebody's on the radical left or on the radical right or so on. But the word radical, ironically, has its roots in the Latin word for root, which is the word radex, and it can be translated root or core. And the idea of the term radical is something that permeates to the core of a thing. It's not something that is tangential or superficial, namely lying on the surface, but it penetrates into the core of the thing. In a recent poll done of professing evangelicals, the overwhelming majority of people who answered particular questions in this poll indicated that they agreed